Time is of the essence. Time is of the essence, and that's why I rise today once again in calling for the immediate passage of the House-led and passed bipartisan standalone aid package for Israel that will provide our ally with $14 billion in military assistance for their ongoing war with the savage Hamas terrorists. This standalone bill does not use Israel as a lever to fund Ukraine funding or to make our border more porous to terrorists and criminals. I want to start by sharing two stories, the stories of two gentlemen I met last week. I'm going to start with Duran. Duran's brother was the mayor of a kibbutz located within a stone's throw of Gaza. As the mayor, he often welcomed Palestinians from Gaza. He shared meals with them and conversed with them. There was a peace-loving family. But on the morning of October 7th, Duran's brother, the mayor, was brutally murdered by Hamas. But that wasn't enough. Next, his brother's mother-in-law was murdered. Then his son was murdered, and finally, a nephew. In the matter of a few hours, a woman lost her husband, her mother, her son, and her nephew. The other story I want to share is of two brothers, Gal and Guy. Now, Gal was the older brother, Guy was the younger brother. They went to the Peace and Love Music Festival just about 3 miles away from the Gaza Strip. And on the morning of October the 7th, Gal was watching over his brother, Guy, and they heard gunshots and they heard rockets going off. And they both decided to run for their cars. They were split up, and while Gal made it home, Guy never did. Later that same day, his family saw horrifying videos of his brother laying on the ground, handcuffed, and who remains a hostage to this day. And of course, we have no idea if Guy's alive or not. So I ask, why is this important? Why is time of the essence? Listen, Israel is a powder keg and it's about ready to explode. For starters, since we were here last, Hamas leadership has declared its desire for a permanent state of war with Israel on all borders. There continues to be a barrage of missiles, rockets, and drone attacks on Israel that's worsened since the wars broke out, with Hamas firing at Israel nearly 10,000 times. Since October the 7th, 50 attacks have occurred on United States military installation. Some 52 American soldiers have been injured, not to mention that we lost 30-some Americans killed on October the 7th by these monsters called Hamas. So why is time of the essence? Right now, there's still hundreds of innocent people, like Gal's brother Guy, being held captive and most likely being tortured and raped by Hamas terrorists, including 10 Americans. So I stand here today again calling on my Democrat colleagues to do the right thing, and today, yes, today, pass this aid for Israel in their time of need. It's been over 5 weeks since the Hamas Army of Terror launched its savage and brutal assault on our greatest ally in the Middle East. The House sent us bipartisan solution that has only been met with obstruction by my friends across the aisle in this chamber. And the American public wants to know why the White House and my friends here across the aisle insist upon leveraging this funding in order to fund their other priorities. Is there really anybody across the aisle that objects to Israel receiving funding and to help stop this war against humanity? This delay is providing this aid is not lost on Israel, raising questions about our commitment as an ally. And perhaps equally concerning is the message it sends to Hamas terrorists, emboldening them in their murderous endeavors. In our slow response reinforces the White House message that America has no red line, and they can continue to attack our military without significant recourse. America is not a fair-weathered friend. We must stand unequivocally with Israel, a country that has stood beside us as a staunch ally through thick and thin. We must pass this aid today. Now, when I met with Duran, who lost, as you recall, 4 members of his family on October the 7th, He pledged with me to help get one clear message to the American people. Hamas does not use logic. We are not dealing with a civilized nation here. Their evil defies any type of logic. They don't make sense. These people are evil monsters who rape, torture, and kill their enemies. And by the way, every person in this room is one of their enemies. Anyone in America who does not believe in their religious ideas is their enemy, who they pledged to kill. Hamas, Iran, and its proxies have all taken an oath to kill every American. Yet some of my colleagues across the aisle have attempted to delay the delivery of this critical military assistance as they call for negotiations with these terrorists and a ceasefire. I'd ask each one of my friends across the aisle who's holding up this bipartisan funding to sit down with a victim of Hamas's savage attacks. Please invite any one of the 170 family members that are here on Capitol Hill today who have family members currently being held as hostages. Their friends and family members being used as a human shield by this evil terrorist group. I'm asking you to sit down with them and listen to their story. Listen to the stories of how Hamas terrorists tortured, maimed, and massacred the most Jewish people in a single day since the horror of horrors, the Nazi Holocaust. I want to make it sure it's clear today, Hamas evil defies any logic. There's no negotiating with them. There's no terms that they would seriously consider. All they understand are death, horror, and destruction. Let's make this point perfectly clear. Our hesitation to provide bipartisan funding to our staunch ally Israel empowers Hamas and gives Iran and its proxies a green light to kill Americans. Mr. President, I'd like to urge everyone to take this measure and adopt it immediately. And for now, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Ohio, my friend Senator Vance.
Mr. President.
Senator from Ohio.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and thanks to my colleague from Kansas here. Look, this is pretty simple, and it's pretty obvious. The United States Senate would pass aid, much-needed aid to Israel today, at this very moment. Aid the House has already passed. It could go to the President's signature this afternoon if my Democratic colleagues would stand down, but they won't. Many of them here are gathered to push back against our very common-sense proposal to offer support to one of our most important allies as they face an existential threat. And it's important for us to be honest about that fact, to acknowledge that Israel would be getting support from this government tomorrow if our Democratic friends didn't stop it today. Now, why are they doing this? You will hear over the next hour or so, we'll hear a lot of slogans, but very little real discussion about our policy in Ukraine or our policy in Israel. The Democrats have decided that this must be combined into a massive hodgepodge package for it to pass the United States Senate. They're doing this because they know that America is united behind Israel, and they want to use our Israeli allies as a political cover in their time of crisis. That is all this is about. You'll hear a whole lot, but that is ultimately what this is about. They know they cannot defend President Biden's disastrous, pointless, and ultimately directionless Ukraine policy, so they'd like to use Israel as a cover. Now, we have before us a hodgepodge of a supplemental from the President of the United States. It combines a few $1 billion for Ukraine with a few $1 billion to Gazan support, because that makes a ton of sense, right? Let's give money to the Israelis to fight back against Hamas, and then let's give some money to Hamas too. I'm sure they won't use it to kill Israelis. It'll just be food and medicine, we're assured, even though we know that because Hamas is the functional government in Gaza, we know if we give them support, that support will ultimately flow to their war effort. At least some of it will. Let's be honest about it. Maybe some of it will flow to the Palestinian people. Call me skeptical, but we know that at least some of it will support the Hamas war effort. Let's be honest about that fact. It's not just that, though. It's not just a few billion for Hamas, a few billion for Israel. It's a few billion to resettle migrants in the United States of America, because God knows we haven't had enough resettlement of migrants in the United States of America over the last couple of years. The fentanyl deaths and the chaos and crime in our country prove it. And then on top of that, let's add $60 billion to Ukraine, because of course we know that Israel and Ukraine are very closely connected. They're so closely connected, in fact, that this chamber can't have a separate debate on one aid package or the other. And then let's add some money to East Asia on top of that. We'll combine all this into a $106 billion supplemental aid package that has very, very little. The gross majority of the money has nothing to do with Israel, and we will do it so that we can cover for the fact that the President of the United States has thrown the world into chaos. What I'd like to do is have a separate debate. Divide these questions into separate conversations and debate them separately. And oh, by the way, use the political will of this chamber to support our Israeli allies yesterday, because they've needed it for much longer than that. Now, let me close with just a couple of final observations here, and then I'll kick it over to my friend, the senator from Missouri. I'm getting sick in this Ukraine policy debate of hearing the same exact slogans repeated. This country has been governed for 30 years on bipartisan foreign policy slogans. Why don't we have a real debate? We are told again and again and again that Vladimir Putin is just like Hitler in the 1930s. If we don't stop him in Ukraine, he's going to march all the way through Europe. What happened to our education system that the only historical analogy we can use in this chamber is World War II? What about World War I, where competing major powers threw the entire world into conflict because we didn't make smart decisions, we didn't de-escalate conflict when we had the opportunity? Why is it that we think Vladimir Putin, who has struggled to fight against the Ukrainians, is somehow going to be able to march all the way to Berlin when he can't conquer a country immediately to his east? Why do we think that everything that happens in the United States and in the world in 2023 is Munich almost a century ago? I am sick of us not having a real debate on this conversation. Vladimir Putin is a bad guy. He should not have invaded Ukraine, but our policy in 2023 has to be different than our policy in the 1940s because the circumstances are different. As Lincoln said, our case is anew, so we must think anew and act anew. You'll also hear that China will be emboldened. China will be terribly emboldened if we don't stop the Russians in Ukraine. Well, call me crazy, but I think the Chinese will be emboldened if we use limited American weapons and give it all to the Ukrainians instead of giving it to the Taiwanese. Now, maybe you disagree, but let's have the debate. And let's have the real debate on the president's Ukraine policy instead of holding Israel hostage. There is nothing more shameful than taking an existential crisis, thousands of dead Israeli civilians, and using them as a fig leaf for a Ukraine policy. If you want to defend the Ukraine policy, defend it. Let the Israel aid flow through, and let's let it flow through today. I yield to my good friend from Missouri.
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. President. I stand in solidarity with my colleagues on separating these issues. I think the American people think that's what we do here. I think the American people think we actually have an appropriations process where we have individual bills come forth and we're offering amendments, and senators can have their say. Republicans and Democrats can have different ideas, offer different amendments, and we vote on those things. That's actually not what happens here at all. And this is now compounding this with this supplemental aid package of putting on a bunch of unrelated issues to try to bootstrap Ukraine aid, when the most pressing need we have right now, the most bipartisan support we have right now, is the Israeli aid. And by the way, it's paid for. Now, I know listening to the hallways buzz in this town about actually paying for something is like unbelievable. Like, it's going to be catastrophic if we actually have that discussion. But I think it's healthy. But I think we need to separate these issues. This is supposed to be the most deliberative body in the history of the world. And what we're told is we can't do that. And to this, my friend from Ohio's point, history doesn't begin and end with Neville Chamberlain. There are a lot of lessons from history about how do you confront these things. And by the way, each theater is very different. What Israel needs is different. What Ukraine might need is different. What Taiwan might need is different. Oh, and by the way, what the United States of America might need is different as we face our chief rival in the world. We've never had one like this in the history of this country with China. We've never had an economic rival, a nuclear power, and a militarized rival like we have with China. Maybe we should be talking, as we talk about this military-industrial base, and I think there's broad support for this, for long-range capability. Our military-industrial base is strapped right now. We're at capacity. We ought to be growing that. I support that, but I think we ought to have a discussion about what does the United States need too. But as it relates to Israel, they have a clear objective, a likelihood of success, broad support. I have yet to hear any of that as it relates to Ukraine. All we get are, again, slogans and fear-mongering. I think, by the way, if you brought up that for an individual vote, it might pass. I don't know. We ought to try it, but I know this would. It should today. But we're going to hear objections now from the Democrats. They're going to object to this and forestall this important aid that our allies in Israel who are facing a real existential threat right now need. Again, and by the way, we've thrown in, border here, and call me skeptical as it relates to Joe Biden and his administration on his seriousness when it comes to the border. When I was Attorney General in Missouri, we fought some of these fights in court, including keeping Remain in Mexico in place. We had to get court orders and contempt orders against this administration to actually follow the judge's order to enforce the law. Now, I am going to support the strongest border package possible, but it's really hard when you have an executive branch that isn't interested in executing the law. And now we have 8+ million people in this country who've come here illegally. They've admitted that quite possibly we have terrorists in this country because we have an open border. Let's have that debate also. But here we are with an opportunity to separate the Israeli funding, again, that has broad support. Each one of these issues, each one of these funding requests have separate realities on the ground, political support, strategies, likelihood of success. Let's respect that, and let's respect the will of the American people that we can actually come up here and do the important work we were sent here to do, which is to have real debate in what's supposed to be the most deliberative body in the history of the world. I yield back to the senator from Kansas.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, let me start by thanking my colleagues from the great state of Ohio and Missouri for standing beside the people of Israel unequivocally. But before we turn the floor back to those who protest too much, to those protest against this standalone Israel funding, let's address some of the objections made by the Senate Democrats last week. It's important that we focus on the urgency of aiding Israel without tying it to other complex, time-killing, unrelated conflicts. In last week's debate here on this Senate floor on Israel's safety and security, Senate Democrats mentioned Ukraine 77 times, more than twice of what they mentioned Israel. I ask Americans to listen to this debate and count for themselves how many times my friends across the aisle mention Ukraine, but turn their back, almost like they're allergic to using the word Israel. They took 45 minutes of their hour-long speeches to make their case for Ukraine funding. Look, I get it. I get it. You want to fund Ukraine. But let's have that debate another day. What Americans understand about Ukraine is that Joe Biden has thrown $113 billion at the problem with minimal accountability. And in return, 200,000 people have died. Americans understand that the war in Ukraine is at a stalemate. And it's going to turn into a 7, probably 10-year war. It's going to turn into a war of attrition. What's the plan, Americans want to know? How much more of their blood and treasure do we have to send overseas? Let's debate Ukraine funding another day. Now, next, my friends across the aisle are going to use the pay for as an excuse. If that's the reason you won't support standalone funding for Israel, then give us a different pay for. But meanwhile, time is of the essence. Your caucus, our caucus, is divided on funding for Ukraine. Your caucus and our caucus is divided on how to solve the open border crisis. And I don't hear any solutions offered from the Republican-controlled House, the People's House. The first thing we don't hear from the White House and Senate leadership is that it's dead on arrival, and vice versa. Anything that we're offering, they say, is dead on arrival. Folks, we're no closer today on figuring out Ukraine funding or how to solve the open border crisis than we were a month ago, 2 months ago, 6 months ago. We're months apart. I think we're infinitely apart from solving these problems. Meanwhile, Hamas and Iran grow more emboldened and World War III inches closer. I don't hear anyone saying from either side of the aisle, don't fund Israel. So why don't we fund Israel today? Don't tell me why we should fund Ukraine. Don't tell me you don't like the pay for. Stand up today and tell me why we shouldn't fund Israel today. Tell me why we shouldn't use Israel as a leverage for your other priorities. Tell me why we shouldn't send a message to Hamas and Iran. And the message that we're going to send them is that we will not tolerate this barbarism, these atrocities, these crimes against humanity. Mr. President, time is of the essence. The House has passed the standalone bill to fund Israel. The Senate should do the same. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 6126, which is received from the House. I further ask the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. We cannot send the message to our allies or to the world that America only stands by some of its allies, that our word is only good some of the time. We also cannot send our adversaries the message that they can simply wait us out, allow us to become distracted, allow our resolve to waver, and that the United States will eventually fail to respond to all of the pressing challenges that we face. Our adversaries are watching carefully to see if we will let Putin win. And the answer must emphatically be absolutely not. I've said it before, I'll say it many times again. We cannot just do half our job here. That's not just wrong, it is dangerous and it is naive. And Mr. President, there are fundamental flaws in the arguments I've heard from my colleagues for splitting up this aid. Let's start with this one. The argument that somehow we haven't debated Ukraine aid, even though we've been debating this even longer than aid for Israel, and even though we've already been forced to punt this aid on to an ally in need before. Ukraine can no more afford a delay than our allies in Israel. Ukraine is at a critical point in a brutal war to defend its sovereignty against Putin's bloody invasion. Abandoning Ukraine is the same as surrendering to Putin and sends a message that he can invade any democracy he'd like with impunity. Fortunately, members on both sides of the aisle do understand this, and clear, overwhelming bipartisan majorities in both the House and Senate have shown they support aid for Ukraine. So we absolutely cannot allow Ukraine aid to get left behind yet again when they are at a critical moment in their heroic fight to protect their homeland and their future as a sovereign democracy. And if my colleagues really wanted more debate on this, we had a robust debate last week, and there was very strong showing from senators who discussed at length why it is so important we keep this aid together in one package. And here's a key point that was raised time and again in that debate. The global challenges we face are all connected, and they are all urgent. We have to be strategic enough to understand that. You know who met with Putin last month? The leader of Hamas. You know who's watching how committed we are to our allies in Ukraine? The government of China. And when it comes to the serious humanitarian crisis in Gaza, let's get something straight. Making sure people have food and water and medical care is not just the right and moral thing to do, it is also very clearly in our national interest as it promotes long-term stability and security. Hamas is hoping that we ignore the humanitarian needs in Gaza. It is hoping that it can drive more people to despair and then anger and then ultimately extremism. In this critical moment, if we only respond to some of the challenges before us, not only will the other challenges will continue to fester, but we will be sending a dangerous message about the limits of American leadership in a world. For our commitments to mean something in the world, they have to be ironclad. For our adversaries to take American leadership seriously, They have to know that we will stand by our allies, that we will stand up for democracy, and we will stand up to dictators. And the way we do that is by passing a strong, unified security package with support for Ukraine and Israel, humanitarian assistance, and smart investments in the Indo-Pacific to support our partners and strengthen deterrence. Now, I'm continuing to work on this package to get it done, and that work could not be more important, nor could it be more urgent. If my colleagues are serious about making sure we act quickly, I urge them to support us in that effort.
Mr. President,
Senator from Rhode Island.
reserving my right to object. I believe we must move forward with emergency funding for our allies, all of our allies, not just the state of Israel, but also Ukraine. We are in a situation where both of these countries are under tremendous stress. But it's very clear that the proposal before us, this unanimous consent to pass the bill, including only funding for Israel, is just, ironically, an attempt to deny funding to the Ukraine. It's not really about helping Israel. It's about making sure we don't continue our support and commitment to Ukraine. That commitment is just as vitally important to us as our solemn commitment to Israel. If we fail to support Ukraine, we will send a very unfortunate message to our adversaries. You can succeed in overrunning America's allies if you simply wait us out. My colleagues on the other side of the debate have been spinning a false narrative that says by providing support for Ukraine, we will deny support for Israel. The truth is that the only obstacle to providing help to both nations is them. And the truth is also that the United States is already supporting the state of Israel. The United States has provided Israel with over $12.4 billion in military assistance and missile defense funding over the last 3 years. And in response to the attacks of October 7, President Biden has moved 2 aircraft carrier strike groups into the region. He ordered Marines into the region. U.S. forces have already engaged and shot down missiles from adversaries in the region. We have also suffered more than 56 injuries of American military personnel because of actions against the United States position in the Middle East. We need to support Israel. We are supporting Israel. We will continue to support Israel, but we cannot abandon Ukraine. They have lost hundreds of thousands of civilians and military personnel. The horrors of October 7th were grotesque. I was in Israel last month. I saw the images, some that have not yet been released, of the slaughter. It was traumatic for the entire state of Israel, in fact, the Jewish community worldwide. But go to Ukraine, go to Bucha, dig up the graves of people shot in the back of the head while their hands were tied. You want to talk about atrocities? Those were atrocities perpetrated by the Russians. So we are fighting forces that are dark and evil in 2 fronts. And we have to support all of those democratic nations, Israel and Ukraine. They are struggling against the darkness. Now, this is not my opinion alone. 2 weeks ago, Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of Defense for Donald Trump and a former congressman from Senator Marshall's home state of Kansas, wrote about Ukraine. Make no mistake, the outcome of this war will have a direct impact on U.S. national security. Should Putin prevail, whether on the battlefield or through a war of attrition that leads to ill-concealed diplomacy, and I would suggest that denying this aid is ill-concealed diplomacy, the war will be felt well beyond Ukraine's borders. Indeed, I would add, if we fail to support Ukraine with funding and equipment, then it is more likely that young American servicemen will be called upon to fight and perhaps die and suffer in Eastern Europe. Because, as so many of my colleagues have suggested, and as Secretary Pompeo suggested, Putin will not be satisfied with simply taking Ukraine. And we could see ourselves engaged in defending one of our NATO allies. I have a very simple sort of notion about American military policy, having had the privilege to serve in our military. I would rather send resources to a country fighting than send American soldiers to do the fighting. And if we don't support Ukraine, that will happen. Let me conclude by simply saying it is time to get serious. We have 3 days before our government runs out of funding. Israel needs our support. Ukraine needs our support. American families and communities are counting on us to deliver critical disaster assistance. They need support for affordable, high-quality child care. There are many needs that we must address. We have to move now, but not isolating our Ukrainian allies. We're in the fight with them, and we will finish the fight with them. And then at this point, I...
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr.
Majority
President,
Whip.
reserving the right to object. I understand the concerns raised by my colleague from Kansas. I share many of them. We've all seen the horrifying videos and images, the scenes of death and destruction perpetrated by Hamas terrorists from October 7th, the deadliest single day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. We all know that a return to the status quo is unacceptable. So I support the Senator's sense of urgency that we must get security aid to Israel as it seeks to defend itself. As a former chair of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, it was my privilege and honor to appropriate literally millions of dollars for Iron Dome, the air defense which today protects Israel. I believe in supporting our allies and friends. In fact, I joined a quarter of my colleagues in the Senate in a letter to President Biden just last week with this very same message. But I want to be clear. Many of my colleagues hearken back in history to the days of Munich and say we're stuck in that thinking. I would say forget Munich for a moment. Think of the days of Moscow. Think of this impromptu visit by the Hamas terrorists to Moscow to sit down with Vladimir Putin. Coincidence? Just happened to be part of the travel plan? No. Hamas had already attacked Israel. They were branded as a terrorist group. Where did they go to find solace? Where did they go to find a friend? They went to Moscow, to Vladimir Putin. Why would we get soft on Putin at this moment? What's happening in Israel is a mirror of what is happening in Ukraine. A tyrant, an atrocious conduct, an unprovoked invasion of a country, innocent people killed. That's the story in both places. And yet the Republicans come to the floor today and say to us, we're only concerned about one. We don't care about the NATO alliance and supporting it further. We don't care about supporting Ukraine further. We just want to help one of our allies. I want to be clear. 2,000 miles north of Israel, there is another country fighting for its survival in the face of a brutal assault, also in need of sustained U.S. security assistance. That country is Ukraine. 2 months ago, I imagine my colleagues all joined me and others meeting in the old Senate chamber on a private, secret, confidential meeting with the President of Ukraine. President Zelensky told us without equivocation that without the continued financial support of the United States and NATO, we will lose this war. He didn't say that once, he said it twice to make it abundantly clear. And now for the Republicans to say, we'll step aside and let the aid to Ukraine, if it's ever going to come much later, is to jeopardize their future and to really make a mockery of the amazing display of courage we've seen in Ukraine resisting the Russian aggression. Just as Secretaries Austin and Blinken argued for emergency aid for Israel before the Senate Appropriations Committee recently, they also stressed the need for aid to Ukraine. Ukrainians have fought bravely, stood up against Russian tyranny, with the United States, the European Union, and countless other countries around the world standing with them. We are the front line of democracy in Ukraine. And to walk away from Ukraine, as the Republicans are suggesting today, is a travesty. To pull back now would be unconscionable, a reflection of America no longer being the world leader it purports to be, and a boon for countries like Russia, China, and Iran, eager to fill the ensuing void. Secretary Blinken said it plainly. In both Israel and Ukraine, democracies are fighting ruthless foes who are out to annihilate them. Secretary Austin went further. Today's battles against aggression and terrorism will define global security for years to come. And for the Republican suggestion today to walk away from assistance to Ukraine, it would unfortunately lead us to that conclusion. Only firm American leadership can ensure that the tyrants, thugs, and terrorists worldwide are not emboldened to commit more aggression and more atrocities. In addition to Israel and Ukraine, we must also remain steadfast in addressing Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific, including Taiwan. And let me say a word about humanitarian aid. One cannot look at the scenes coming out of Gaza without realizing there are many thousands of innocent victims, people who are not part of a terrorism of the Hamas leadership, people who are simply trying to survive. The scenes coming from hospitals on a daily basis are a reminder to us that there is a desperate need for humanitarian aid. Al-Shifa Hospital this morning displayed photographs of a dozen infants who have been separated from their ventilators because the electricity is off and there's no water in the hospital. To provide humanitarian aid to the helpless, guiltless victims in this part of the world is consistent with the values of the United States, and I support it without reservation. Humanitarian assistance is not only the right thing to do, it will save lives. It'll help prevent the next conflict. It'll serve as a down payment on our own security in the future. I urge my colleagues to resist this effort by the Republicans to walk away from Ukraine and to ignore the obvious consequences. The people of Ukraine have shown extraordinary courage. I hope a majority of the Senate will as well. And I yield to Senator Van Hollen.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. At this moment of danger and peril around the world, we, the United States of America, must support our friends and democracies that are under attack from brutal adversaries. That means supporting Israel's right to defend itself in the aftermath of the brutal Hamas attacks of October 7th. It also means ensuring that the people of Ukraine can defend themselves against Putin's rank aggression. Make no mistake about it. This proposal on the floor today is tantamount to saying the Ukrainian people should surrender to Vladimir Putin. It's waving the white flag. If we don't support Ukraine, not only will the Ukrainians lose, democracy will lose around the world. And I have to say that Ronald Reagan would be rolling in his grave today to see the Republican Party abandoning Ukraine in the fight for democracy and freedom. You know, most of us gathered recently in the old Senate chamber with President Zelensky, and he was very clear that the Ukrainians will fight on to defend their democracy and their sovereignty. But if the United States doesn't stand by the people of Ukraine, Putin will have the upper hand. So for goodness sakes, our Ukrainian friends are spilling blood, they're giving lives. The very least we can do is step up and continue to provide military assistance so that they can defend themselves. And this is not only about Ukraine. It is about making sure that our allies, our NATO allies, understand that the United States will continue to stand up against aggression. If the United States walks away, the NATO alliance will begin to collapse. It also sends a terrible signal to others around the world, other autocrats, who are watching very carefully what the United States and our allies do with respect to Ukraine. I've heard my colleagues say it's only speculation as to what our allies in the Indo-Pacific would think if we walked away. Well, let me tell you, they have told us very clearly. Leaders in Japan and South Korea, friends in Taiwan, they are watching very closely what the United States does with respect to Ukraine, just as President Xi is keeping one eye on Taiwan as he keeps the other eye on what's happening in Ukraine. Now, President Biden is scheduled to meet with President Xi tomorrow in San Francisco at the APEC conference. And I can tell my colleagues that don't pretend here on the Senate floor otherwise that you're going to be really tough on China, that you're going to support Taiwan if you cut loose and run when it comes to Ukraine, because they are intricately connected. Just ask the people in Taiwan, ask the people in the Indo-Pacific region. Finally, I keep hearing my Republican colleagues talk about their so-called pay-for, as if the $14 billion cut to the IRS pays for the $14 billion in support for Israel. This debate's been going on for a couple weeks, so it can't be that our colleagues aren't paying attention to what both the IRS and the Congressional Budget Office have said. They have said, far from paying for it, it will actually increase the deficit. That was the testimony of all the witnesses, Democrats and Republicans, in the Budget Committee last week. Why will it increase the deficit? Because you're taking away funds that the IRS is using to go after very wealthy tax deadbeats, people who are not paying the taxes that are already due and owing. You're saying to the IRS, we're going to deny you the funds to go after those very wealthy deadbeats. And because you can't collect the revenue from those tax deadbeats, the United States deficit's going to go up, not down. So that doesn't pay for it. Don't call it a pay for it. That's simply a fraud. It's not true. And what is really astounding, I've heard my colleagues use the word leverage a couple times. It's a new cynicism to use our efforts to support Israel, to provide what amounts to a don't have to pay your taxes message to very wealthy Americans. And it's like nobody ever seems to miss an opportunity to give another tax break to very wealthy folks on the Republican side. In this case, it's not a tax break. It's actually just requiring that people pay the taxes already due and owing. So stop calling it a pay for. Let's stand up for Ukraine and democracy in Ukraine. Yes, let's continue to support Israel's right to defend itself. And let's stand up as the United States of America to ensure that we send a message to our allies around the world that we're with them and our adversaries around the world that we will stand by our friends. And with that, I yield to the senator from Colorado, Senator Bennett.
Thank you. Thank you very much to my colleague.
Senator from Colorado.
Maryland, thank you, Mr. President, reserving the right to object. I'm glad to be here today. I think it's important for us to have this debate. This is a debate. People on the other side of the aisle are saying it's not one. I heard my colleague from Ohio talking earlier about slogans, slogans, slogans. This is all about slogans. I cannot believe the degree to which the accomplishments by the Ukrainian people are being diminished on this floor or being diminished in this debate. It is absolutely disgraceful. They are this close to winning this war. There is a freeze today on the battlefield, on the front line, in part because Putin knows exactly what's going on here. He knows about the debate that's going on here. He knows, my colleagues, that he's losing on the battlefield. He understands that. NATO understands that. Xi Jinping understands that. He knows that. He's losing on the battlefield. He's counting on winning on Capitol Hill. He's counting on winning on this battlefield. Let me tell you something. This isn't about slogans. Let's talk about what Ukraine has done over the last 2 years. I haven't heard anybody talk about that in this discussion or this debate. I hope my colleagues on the other side are listening, because you will not hear in your lifetime a list of greater courage or sacrifice than what you will hear from the Ukrainians, and it's not slogans. They defeated and reversed the Russian attack on Kyiv, which, by the way, Kyiv was supposed to fall in 72 hours. They reversed that. They forced Russia to retreat from Chernihiv and Sumy. They won the Battle of Kharkiv. They took back Kherson. They took back Snake Island. Ukraine has taken back more than half of the land that Russia took from them in this invasion. Colleagues, more than half. Nobody 2 years ago would have predicted that. Everybody would have said Putin would never relinquish that land. They almost single-handedly restarted commercial grain trade with Asia and Africa. Why does that matter? That matters so that the whole rest of the world can be fed, so they'll stay in the fight that we have led, that no other country can lead but the United States of America, even though my colleagues on the other side have gotten tired. Last month, read it, look it up. I'll put it in the record, Mr. President. There is an amazing article over the weekend about this in the New York Times. Last month, may I put it in the record? Thank you, Mr. President. They largely neutralized the Black Sea Fleet. They don't even have a real Navy. They don't have a Navy. And through their dedication and through their imagination and their willingness to sacrifice, they have managed to neutralize the Black Fleet. There's nobody that thought they could do this. This is all while Russians outnumbered Ukrainians 3-1 on the battlefield. I heard from my colleagues how much more American lives, how much more American treasure. There's not an American losing their life. The Ukrainians are losing their life in the name of democracy. In total, Ukraine has killed 300,000 Russian fighters. Thank you, Ukraine, for doing the work that NATO has not been asked to do, that the United States has not been asked to do. Putin knows he's losing this war in Ukraine. The only question he has is he going to win the war here in the United States Congress? Who's going to lose Ukraine? And the people that are here today saying, this is not a lesson from World War II, this is a lesson from World War I, these are the people that are going to lose Ukraine. Do we have any right to be fatigued, colleagues? When we haven't lost 100,000 people? When all we're being asked to do is manufacture the weapons that Ukraine is using on this battlefield, putting American people to work to support Ukraine and democracy? That's what we're being asked to do. Can we possibly be fatigued at this moment? I suppose we could be having a very different debate if Ukraine hadn't been as successful as they have been, but they have been successful. And what we know is if we roll over now for Vladimir Putin, if we stop providing Ukraine with their weapons, and they're out of bullets, Mr. President, they're out of bullets as we stand here today. They've got $1 billion left. That if we stop providing them with resources, if we stop providing them with the intelligence that we provided them, they're going to lose this war. President Zelensky came here and told you that. We will win this war if you stick with us. We will lose this war if you abandon us. We cannot abandon Ukraine at this moment. So I know I have other colleagues on the floor who need to speak today, Mr. President. I am glad this has been recorded for history. I am glad today's debate has been recorded for history, because when they ask who lost this war to Vladimir Putin, it's not going to be a question of rhetoric or debate points. It's going to be a question of a war that we were actually on the verge of winning, and a war that we walked away from and lost, with repercussions to every single corner of this world, including where Xi Jinping is sitting right now in Beijing. And don't forget about it. Don't forget about it. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to thank Senator Murray and Senator Reid for leading us in this time. I want to make two relatively brief points to add to the discussion, and then I'll turn it over to others of my colleagues. First, I understand that my Republican colleagues want to avoid the question of Republican priorities. The fact of the matter is, an Israel-only funding bill passed through the House of Representatives, and attached to it was a massive giveaway for the richest Americans, millionaires and billionaires, who don't pay their taxes. And so, as we chart the path forward for a bill that only funds Israel, we know in the House of Representatives it has to be matched with a massive, massive giveaway for millionaires and billionaires. And I don't think you can ignore that fact that a large swath of the Republican Party is using this crisis in Israel in order to deliver yet another gift to the very small slice of Americans who don't need any more gifts. There are 700 billionaires in this country who have more net worth than 50% of all Americans. The rules are already rigged in favor of the super wealthy. And so the idea that we would facilitate a plan in the House of Representatives to use Israel aid as a means to continue to rig the rules in favor of those ultra-rich Americans is just incredibly distasteful, and it's a signal about where the Republican Party priorities are today. Second, I do want to talk about what Senator Vance and others talked about the lazy precedent referencing, the sloganeering that they accuse Democrats of engaging in. So it is correct that what is happening today in Ukraine does not have a modern precedent, right? Because never before in our lifetime, in the post-World War II order, has a large nuclear nation like Russia invaded another large neighboring nation with the purpose of annexation. What Russia is trying to do is to fundamentally change the rules, fundamentally shift international norms that have been in place since World War II. At the foundation of it is that big countries don't change their borders through force, through aggression. It is important to understand that these are the rules that have undergirded the last 70 years of U.S. growth and U.S. national security. And so we don't believe that we should support Ukraine because we just believe that Vladimir Putin is Adolf Hitler. We don't believe we should support Ukraine to perpetuate some slogan about American greatness. No, we believe that we have an interest as the most powerful nation in the world, as the nation that has benefited most from the post-World War II order, to defend those rules, because if we don't, no one else will. And it just strikes me that my Republican colleagues, who have this fatalistic view of what is going to happen in Ukraine, just really view America as weak, as impotent, and as powerlessness in the face of this unprecedented aggression from Vladimir Putin. America's greatness is connected to our willingness to stand up and lead at moments of crisis. And this is a unique moment of crisis without precedent, which is why it requires the United States to stand against Russia's aggression. Listen, for thousands of years, we know this because you read about it in your history books growing up. For thousands of years prior to the establishment of the post-World War II order, this world was defined by state-on-state, civilization-on-civilization violence and conflict. People labored under the constant threat that their entire world would be ended by another one of these civilization-on-civilization conflicts. But this was back at the time when weapons were crude. They were swords, they were bows and arrows, then they were simple firearms. Millions died, but millions also survived. We live in a very different era today, where we frankly have to be more worried, not less worried, not permissive and fatalistic about the consequences of re-entering a world and a paradigm in which states enter into conflict against other states. Why? Because we now live in a world filled with weapons of mass destruction. Not just nuclear weapons, but other highly sophisticated weapons. And so now, this kind of conflict that Russia and Ukraine are engaged in That's the kind of conflict that can wipe out millions in a day. That's why the United States of America has stood up for the post-World War II order. That's why we have fought and sometimes died to maintain it. And this is the most significant affront to that order, an order that has protected this country, an order that has protected our economy, an order that has saved millions of lives in our lifetime. It is hard. Ukraine's mission is difficult. In a short-term, satisfy-me-now culture, I understand that many of my Republicans get phone calls from their constituents saying, if Ukraine hasn't won this war tomorrow, I'm not interested any longer. But this conflict matters, and it matters that we stick with Ukraine, because if we lose, we are living in an entirely new world. The cap is off state-on-state violence, and pretty soon America will be in one of those conflicts with another nuclear nation. And we won't be talking about thousands of Ukrainians dying. We'll be talking about millions of Americans dying. So I appreciate my colleagues being here today. I think this is as important as it gets. I think we really are deciding the future of this world and the rules that govern it. And I join my colleagues in objecting to this motion, and I'll yield the floor to Senator Schatz.
Mr. President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Reserving the right to object, and I'll be pretty quick here. I have rarely seen such a cynical piece of legislation on the Senate floor. I have rarely seen it. And I think the point that Chris Van Hollen and Chris Murphy made, I think, is the first point, which is when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and so whenever there is an opportunity to legislate, even in the foreign policy space, even when we are in a global fight against fascism, the first thing that comes to the mind of many people on the other side of the aisle is, how can we make life easier for the wealthiest among us? Like, it's literally got nothing to do with Israel aid or Ukraine aid or Indo-Asia Pacific security matters. Just whenever you get a chance, throw in an opportunity to enrich the wealthiest among us who are already not paying their fair share of taxes. So that's the frame, right? This is where we start, which is, I've got an idea, we should cut taxes again. I got an idea, let's gut the IRS so that they don't have the ability to audit these billionaires, many of whom don't pay taxes in the first place. So that's how you should understand this from the jump. The second thing you should understand is we really are in a global fight against fascism and authoritarianism. And if there's one thing that I think the last 2 or 3 years, frankly the last 7 years, have taught us, it is believe what the authoritarians say they want to do. Believe Hamas when they say they want to wipe Israel off the map and that they're not done. Believe Putin when he says that the biggest mistake that the Soviet Union ever made was perestroika and glasnost and all of that. Believe him when he says after he takes Ukraine, he will turn his eye to the Baltics. Believe all of these people. They do exactly what they've been saying they would do, and here we are hoping against hope. That maybe they don't mean it, maybe their ambitions aren't so murderous. They do it every time. And the idea that we would separate these two fights, even though these people are aligned, these fascists are aligned, this authoritarian movement is increasingly aligning itself, perhaps because of the internet, perhaps because of globalization. But whatever it is, there is an actual global fascist authoritarian movement. And they are on the march. And the idea that we would fund Israel's security needs and leave Ukraine behind because what? Ukraine's in Europe? Because Donald Trump doesn't like Ukraine aid? Because it's getting hard? Because it's getting tiring? Because it's getting expensive? Listen to those arguments, my God. This man wants to take Europe and has a plan to do so. And as Senator Bennett said, and this is a key point, God bless these Ukrainian fighters. They are the ones fighting and dying. They are the ones spilling blood to keep Europe peaceful, to establish that nobody can change the boundaries of a country using violence only. God bless them for doing this. God bless them for their sacrifice, for their ingenuity, for frankly exceeding everybody's reasonable expectations. God bless them for their sacrifice. All they need from us is resources. And we are the most wealthy country in the history of humankind, and we are saying it's a little too long. We haven't won yet. Trump doesn't like it. This is kind of getting expensive. What a bunch of terrible arguments in the scheme of things. What a bunch of terrible arguments when we look back 20, 30, 50 years from now at this debate. No one is going to ask whether this was emergency spending or in a supplemental or in the regular appropriations process or in a CR or a CR in omnibus. They're just going to ask, did we stand with the free world like Americans always do? And so this has got me a little angry. This has got me a little frustrated because I just thought, I really did think, and I'm not naive, but I really did think that on an issue like this, we could put our partisanship aside. We could put our fealty to either our current president or the former president aside and just say, look, this is good for the free world. We're just going to do it together.
Mr. President.
I'd now, with your permission through the chair, defer to the President Pro Tem.
Mr. President.
The senator from Kansas.
I call for regular order.
Is there objection for the request? Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas still has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to my colleagues for their comments today, for their arguments. Many were good arguments. Some of the facts the American people disagree with. Some of the conclusions the American people disagreed with. What I heard today was once again from my colleagues spending 80% of their time focusing on Ukraine funding. But I didn't hear one person say why we shouldn't go ahead and fund Israel today, why we shouldn't send a bill to the president's desk today. Look, we have debated Ukraine at length. Put a bill on the floor. Let's vote on Ukraine funding. My friends across the aisle have said that Ukraine is winning this war. And many of the same reasons they give us to continue to support Ukraine are the same words I heard in grade school why we should support the cause in Vietnam. It's the same arguments. If Ukraine is winning, then why is Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary abandon Ukraine? Why is the front line not moving? Some of my friends brought up aid. Look, if you want aid to the hospitals in Gaza, if you want aid to Gaza itself, then tell Iran to stand down. Tell Hamas to release the hostages. I don't hear anyone talking about that. Tell Hamas to surrender. Let's send a message from this Senate that we unequivocally stand beside Israel. And I'll close with this. One of my friends across the aisle talked about President Reagan. And what I will remember about President Reagan and before him Eisenhower, that they stressed peace through strength. But this White House is giving us war through weakness. Mr. President, time is of the issue. We need to get Israel the funding. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, my colleagues from Kansas, from Ohio, and Missouri have raised a raft of questions to which I will offer a few timely and simple answers. Look up, look back, look ahead. To my colleague from Kansas, his predecessor, Bob Dole, a senator who was a great leader in this chamber, was a champion for the power of humanitarian aid around the world. And I will not yield without speaking to a piece of this supplemental that has been largely ignored: the critical role of humanitarian aid in sustaining partners and allies, in averting humanitarian catastrophe, and yes, in sustaining both Ukraine and Israeli national security. But first, if I might, let's look back for a moment to history. My colleague from Ohio complained that we somehow had not thoroughly debated Ukraine. I believe we have, but I'm happy to have us engage for hours more, because there are critical lessons from the past that inform the strong, broad, and bipartisan support for aid to Ukraine. The last time I went to Kyiv, I traveled with his predecessor, Senator Rob Portman, a co-chair of the Ukraine caucus in this body, a determined and committed supporter of Ukraine. Why? Let's look back for a moment. In the run-up to the Second World War, a famous American aviator, Charles Lindbergh, a man who was decorated for his exploits and his exploration, joined a nationwide movement whose slogan was America First. America First seemed to say that we should stay out of the roiling conflicts in the Pacific and in Europe, that we should step back and allow the armies of the Nazis to advance across Western Europe and allow the armies of Imperial Japan to advance across Asia, because those were not our concerns. In fact, he gave a publicized speech in favor of neutrality just on the eve of the attack on Pearl Harbor. History proved that America First almost risked America alone in a world overcome by authoritarianism. And I will tell you that mistake is a mistake my colleagues risk making now. If they want to make America weak again, they can go back to the arguments of the isolationist Republicans on the verge of the Second World War. But, sir, to my colleague from Kansas, I'll say you don't really have a debate with us. You have a debate with your own leadership. I have heard on this floor clear, forceful, focused speeches in defense of Ukraine, the critical role of our support for Ukraine, not from Democrats alone, but from some of the most seasoned and capable and leading members of the Republican caucus, including my colleagues from Texas and from Kentucky. There is broad support for Ukraine. And I frankly think, to answer the question of my colleague from Ohio, how are these possibly connected? The attack of Hamas on Israeli civilians, the attack of Russia on Ukrainian civilians, I say you need only look up. What's that sound? It's Iranian drones and missiles raining death on innocent civilians in Israel and Ukraine. These conflicts are profoundly connected. My colleague from Ohio suggested that President Biden has thrown the world into chaos. I do not have the time to fully rebut this ill-informed point, but I'll suggest that Vladimir Putin's aggression in Ukraine, and in particular the terrorism of Hamas in Israel, is not the cause. Of that, President Biden is not the cause, but in fact has been a forceful, timely, and responsive leader. His response to the attack on Israel, I hope, has earned broad bipartisan support because it was personal, forceful, and timely. All of us here are standing, calling for the release of hostages by Hamas, standing in strong support of Israel, and insisting that we advance at the same time the aid that is desperately needed by our close allies. My colleague from Kansas asked a critical question. Will we show the United States as a fair-weather friend? To my colleague, I'll say, sir, that's exactly why I join my colleagues in objecting to this narrow Israel-only aid package, because we cannot show that we will fail to aid Ukraine. Last, it was asked by several of my colleagues, why would we send humanitarian aid into Gaza? It will inevitably all fall into the hands of Hamas. Who supports this? I will submit for the record, with unanimous consent, if I might, Mr. President, a letter from the Israeli embassy to the Congress of the United States.
Without objection.
Who supports humanitarian aid into Gaza with appropriate measures of inspection? The Israeli government. They say it is critical to bolstering their national security. Look up, look back, look forward. Look up, you'll see the missiles and drones of Iran raining down on innocent civilians. Look back, you'll see the mistakes of isolationism. Look forward, and you'll see there is a bipartisan path to supporting humanitarian relief globally, to supporting aid to Israel and Hamas, to investing in border security, to taking up and passing a robust supplemental as we can and as we should. And for that reason, I join my colleagues in opposing the motion made by my colleague from Kansas, and I yield the floor to my colleague from Minnesota.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I rise today alongside my colleagues, including Senator Coons and Senator Murray, to implore my colleagues to hold firm in their support of Ukraine. I have sat here for the last hour and listened to these speeches and listened to some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, which I know does not reflect all of them. And this is what I came away with. The focus on, oh, you just want to go backwards, the analogies to talking about past decisions in Munich and Vietnam. We all are students of history. I'm focused on now. I'm focused on what is happening now. And like my colleagues here, I have strongly condemned the massacre, the terrorist attack by Hamas, and the democracy of Israel. And we stand with Israel and the right to defend, but we also stand with the idea that we should continue to provide humanitarian relief in Gaza and around the world. And I think one of the ironies of the statement of our colleague from Ohio and some of our other colleagues was that he failed to mention that actually Israel has come out this week also supporting the humanitarian aid. So that's one thing that I think needs to get corrected. The second, as we look at where we are now, he mentioned Vladimir Putin called him a bad guy. Those were his words, a bad guy. I think it's a lot more than that. This is a tyrant. This is a ruler who has committed war crimes, who has downed passenger planes, who has invaded a democracy. So let's get the facts straight about Vladimir Putin. The other thing that is now is to not see this as connected is just plain wrong. What kind of drones was Russia using? Iranian drones. Who took the meeting with some of their senior officials from Russia? Who went there? Hamas. Hamas went to Russia after this terrorist attack. When we stand for democracies one place, we stand for democracies in other places. And our colleague from Ohio referred to some of the president's requests as a hodgepodge. A hodgepodge. I was thinking of that word and what's in this request and this budget. Protection of a nuclear plant, the largest nuclear plant, not just in Ukraine, but in Europe. When his predecessor, Senator Portman, and I were in Ukraine, when we met with President Zelensky, where we actually talked about the strong support and the strong Ukrainian community in Ohio and in Minnesota. When we met with them, a major focus of ours was a nuclear plant, because we didn't know how long the Ukrainians were able to hold the line to protect that plant from not just contamination in Ukraine, but contamination all over Europe. That's what's in what our colleague has called a hodgepodge of a budget. What else? Supporting NATO. I was just with the leader of Estonia. Small country, yes, but they have given over 1% of their military budget, of their country, to Ukraine. Are we just going to turn away on NATO because we think it's a hodgepodge to support our allies in countries like in Great Britain, our allies in countries like France and Germany and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and Georgia and, yes, Ukraine? We're just going to say it's a hodgepodge. Or how about, what else is in that hodgepodge? Well, what else is in the hodgepodge is things like air defense, things like munition, things like small arms. That's what we're talking about here when we talk about the help that we give to Ukraine. Then I looked at some of the percentages as I sat here of other small nations that given much more than the US. We're at something like 0.3%, right? These countries are at over 1% in the help that they've given Ukraine. They have taken in 4 million, count that, 4 million refugees in Europe. So when we help Ukraine, we are not doing it alone, colleagues. We are standing with our allies. We are standing with our best trading partners. We are standing with the world for democracy. So this is not in a vacuum. This is as the president once said, a big effing deal. What about Vladimir Putin? And Senator Bennett got at this. He's failing. He tried to capture Kyiv, but he failed. He tried to wipe Ukraine off the map, but he failed. He tried to break the Ukrainian spirit, but he has made it stronger. He tried to break NATO, but NATO has grown. Ukraine has persevered against all odds. To abandon our partners now would be a dereliction of our duty to defend a democracy and an embarrassment to this nation. And yes, it would create a much bigger national security risk, not just for our allies, but for our country. I've had the privilege of visiting Ukraine, not just with Senator Portman, but another visit as well with a number of our Republican colleagues. Each time, I was struck by the strength of the people who put their lives on the line. The ballerina has to don camo and go to the front line. The cafe owner donating food to people in need. The DJ at the National Call Center using her platform to find missing loved ones. We must not forget President Zelensky's words in September. There is not a soul in Ukraine that does not feel gratitude to you, America. So that's what we have to remember. They're watching in Ukraine. The democracy are watching. And as Leader McConnell has said, think of it as an axis of evil, China, Russia, and Iran. This is not just a test for Ukraine, it is a test for the United States and for the free world. And the path toward greater security for all of us is simple. Help Ukraine win the war. Thank you. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon is with us today to speak.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
I ask unanimous consent the following senators be permitted to speak prior to the scheduled recess: Senator Merkley, Senator Lee, and Senator Cornyn.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
Reserving the right to object. Our colleague from Kansas has come to the floor and asked for unanimous consent for a bill of some major significance. We've heard a lot of my colleagues explain why this Israel-only bill would be a disaster because it throws Ukraine overboard. And then I heard his rebuttal. And his rebuttal was, well, why not do Israel alone? As if we hadn't had this conversation for the last hour and a half. We know the answer because the House has said it will pass an Israel alone bill, leaving Ukraine abandoned. So this, you see, is about abandoning Ukraine. That has powerful international consequences. Allow Ukraine to be torn apart by Putin's brutal invasion. That is what this UC does. It makes a group of American senators Putin's best friend. This bill, this UC, this unanimous consent for this bill, will shatter the Atlantic Alliance, deeply, deeply damaging the power of democracies working together. This bill will fracture NATO, because if we don't stand with Ukraine, how many doubts creep in about any enduring effort to defend a smaller country assaulted by a dictator next door. This bill will destroy American leadership in defending democracies. This bill will empower dictators around the world. They conclude they can outlast the attention span of a coalition of democratic republics as long as they stay the course. Now, some of my colleagues in support of this bill say it's costing a lot of money. The budget that Russia is dedicating to this battle is some estimated 30% of their defense expenditures. Our GDP here, it's 1.5%. 1.5% versus 30%. If we can't stay the course, when the question is $1.50 out of every 100, when would we ever stay the course? The last time this globe saw such complicity placating a vicious conqueror was when Chamberlain went to Munich. In Munich, Chamberlain told Hitler that you can take that massive slice of Czechoslovakia and England will look the other way. We'll simply declare peace in our time. But that appeasement by Chamberlain didn't produce peace in our time. Instead, that appeasement of Hitler stoked Hitler's appetite for conquering adjacent lands. That appeasement of Hitler set the stage for the Second World War with massive loss of life and treasure for the United States of America and nations around the world. Appeasing Putin today is as wrong as appeasing Hitler 85 years ago. We must instead stand with the freedom-loving, fierce-fighting, democracy-defending people of the Republic of Ukraine. If you come to this chamber and you have followed former President Trump's lead in loving Putin, then say yes to this unanimous consent request and throw Ukraine under the bus. If you love China, love their authoritarian conquests, love their desire to invade Taiwan, then come to this floor and support this unanimous consent request for this bill and throw Ukraine under the bus. But if you care about freedom, if you are a champion of democracy, if you believe that democracies must stand together against tyranny, against autocracy, against imperialist invaders, if you respect the courage and fortitude of the people of Ukraine, then absolutely say you object to this UC request, that you object to this bill. We here in the U.S. Senate must not countenance Putin appeasement. We must not countenance complicity in another Munich moment. So, Mr. President, I join my colleagues today in preparing to object to this bill. I yield to my colleague from Washington State.
Taz to be recognized next.
Mr. President, this is a moment in history when we have the chance to stand up and provide assistance to an ally, an important ally in a tough part of the world that has a lot of enemies in common in the United States. Israel was savagely attacked without provocation on the morning of October 7th of this year, just over a month ago. The most unspeakably savage human attacks were carried out on men and women of Israel whose offense was simple: living in Israel. The people of Hamas wanted them dead because of the fact that they're Jewish and they live in Israel. Their humanity, their religion, their ancestry, and their geography all qualified them to be deemed unworthy of living by the savages of Hamas. These savages will continue in their butchery, and in so doing degrade humanity for as long as they can get away with it. Long-standing relationships between the United States and Israel have set us on a course in which we can reasonably be expected to provide reasonable assistance to Israel. Now, to be clear, what Israel is asking of us is not grand. They're not asking us to go there and fight their war for them, nor are they asking us to provide hundreds of billions of dollars over many years in order to help them achieve that effort. No, it's a relatively modest request that they're making of us. And compared to other requests that we are considering from other parts of the world, including and especially Ukraine, this is a modest one. This is, moreover, an effort that they believe they can carry out successfully in a matter of weeks or months, not something spanning out over the better part of a decade. Finally, there is overwhelming bipartisan, bicameral support for aid to Israel. It's already passed the House of Representatives. It's done. We could bring it up right now. We could pass it today, and it could be on the desk of the President of the United States in the Oval Office just a few blocks from here by tonight. To my knowledge, there's not a single member of this body who would object to consolidating the otherwise burdensome and time-consuming process that it takes to bring a bill to the floor of the United States Senate. We could have this done today, and I predict that the vote would be overwhelming, if not unanimous, then very nearly so, with the number of dissenting votes probably in the single digits, probably in the low single digits, if in fact there were any no votes at all. So the point here is that where you've got two proposals, two ideas to offer support in two different conflicts. One is overwhelmingly popular and bipartisan and could easily pass both houses. The other is troubling and fraught with questions. Also happens to be the proposal, the one for Ukraine, that's a lot more expensive and that involves a conflict that is now, we're being told, a conflict that's likely to stretch out for the better part of a decade with no end in sight. And that's a conflict where, since the beginning of last year, we've spent $113 billion on the conflict in Ukraine. They are, moreover, analytically distinct, just as they're geographically distinct. They involve different considerations. We ought to consider them together. This is, Mr. President, one of the real maladies of Washington today, is the fact that in many instances, Congress can't seem to resist the impulse to consolidate support for one thing and use that as leverage to bring about support for something else, for which there's no comparably large, bipartisan, broad-based support. That's unfortunate. The people of Israel need this aid now. Let's get this done now, and we'll consider Ukraine on its own merits. There's no reason to delay. We should bring this up today, get it passed today, get it signed into law this very evening. Thank you, Mr. President.